In 1986, British Gas was privatised. It was part of a revolution in the ownership of public utilities and the breaking down of monopolies. With electricity following in 1990, consumers would ultimately find themselves choosing energy suppliers based on price.
Essentially, the whole idea was that combination of competition and private capital and private enterprise would bring dynamism and efficiency into what was seen as quite an expensive and inefficient sector.
In this episode, we learn how the privatisation of the energy market led to the introduction of Ofgem.
We had electricity regulator and we had the gas regulator, and we brought those two together.
And how the regulator's role is facing up to the challenge of moving away from an energy mix heavily reliant on fossil fuels to a more renewable future.
If you look at the levelised cost of energy, which is a measure of how expensive the technology is in total, renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil fuels.
I'm Claire Nazir, and this is Inside Energy, a podcast by Ofgem, exploring how the energy we use today has evolved and how it will change in the future. As we've heard in the last episode, the oil crisis and the subsequent 3-day week almost brought Britain to its knees in the mid-1970s. But it also led to a huge re-evaluation of our approaches to energy markets. Two key aspects to this were diversification of energy supply and liberalisation of energy markets. When Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979, she saw a future for Britain's energy provision, not under state control, but under private ownership.
This was a policy to take what was a vertically integrated, state-owned energy system and split it up into its component parts, and wherever possible, introduce market mechanisms and competition.
You remember Akshay Kaul from the last episode. He's Ofgem's Director General of Infrastructure.
Essentially, the whole idea was that combination of competition and private capital and private enterprise would bring dynamism and efficiency into what was seen as quite an expensive and inefficient sector by the late 1980s.
British Gas was first to be privatised in 1986, followed by the electricity sector in 1990.
I was fascinated by this experiment because the idea that you could use market mechanisms to keep the lights on, and not have it all command and control in a vertically integrated public sector setup was just such an alien concept. The UK was a world leader in setting up the arrangements where, market participants would bid for buying and selling power, and then having a way of making sure that although there was competition and there was lots of different people trying to buy and sell power, consumers always had strong security of supply, and they received a reduction in the overall cost of their energy.
The privatisation of British Gas was marked by a major public share offering, famously promoted by the Tell Sid campaign, which encouraged ordinary citizens to buy shares.
You can still apply for shares in British Gas. Applications can be handed in at any branch of NatWest or Bank of Scotland by close of business tomorrow.
Are you Sid?
Yes.
Oh boy, have I got a message for you.
Perhaps the first time the British public engaged in energy markets.
There was a big public share flotation, and the whole idea that the Thatcher government had was that it would be an incredibly democratic thing to do, to have these national utilities, instead of being owned by the government, they would be owned directly by members of the public. And that was the background to the Tell Sid campaign. So word of mouth encouraged people to buy shares in the flotation process.
The selling off of both gas and electricity led to significant market reforms and setting the stage for further liberalisation and competition, and the entry of new private companies which increased competition and aimed to improve efficiency and service quality.
I think in the 90s, there was a great influx of American capital. We saw a huge amount of M&A, mergers and acquisitions activity. A lot of American companies acquired a lot of the British utilities. And I think that was fine. The general sense at the time was the capital markets were pretty efficient, and this would ultimately drive costs down for consumers because there would be a lot of liquid capital coming into these markets.
Consumers benefited from more choices and competitive pricing, although the impact on prices varied over time due to factors like wholesale gas costs and regulatory change. The introduction of competition meant companies had to improve their services and pricing to attract and retain customers, and the markets began to move even quicker.
Yes, I think as we turn the century and we get into the noughties and then the 2010s, there was a general trend of the public markets withdrawing from the sector and an increasing trend towards private equity. After the Telcid campaign, the public was literally owning a lot of these utilities to begin with. It took them out of those public markets into the private equity, private capital market. And so I think the result of that has been a degree of consolidation in the utility sector, both on generation as well as retail.
This led to the rise of the Big Six, as they were called, the major energy suppliers of the UK. 3 of them had their roots in Britain: Scottish Power, SSC and Centrica, the latter being one of 2 companies formed out of the old British Gas. But also competing for business was French company EDF and German companies E.ON and npower. Heading into the 21st century, the UK energy structure had received a major shake-up. The need for a strong regulator was clear, and that's where Ofgem comes into the story.
We came into being in 1999, with all our statutory responsibilities, and we were merging 2 different regulators.
This is Ofgem Senior Manager Jenny Boothe.
We had electricity regulator and we had the gas regulator, and we brought those 2 together. So obviously there would need to be some rationalisation of the rules. Our statutory duties, first thing it talks about is protecting consumers, current and future. Also making sure there is an effective retail market.
Ofgem, the Office for Gas and Electricity Markets, to give it its full title. It's an independent regulator that exists by government statute.
We are independent in the sense that we are not answerable directly to a minister, but we do work with them in terms of working through the mechanics of how we deliver those high-level policies.
At the beginning, the objectives were twofold.
So some of the things that were front of mind at the time were things primarily protecting consumers. If you've got consumers of all different knowledge, capability and so on, and understanding around energy, how do we ensure that all consumers are treated fairly? So that was a fundamental, I think that was probably the primary objective at the time, to protect consumers. I think the second thing was understanding how we secure supply, because now we're opening and liberalising the retail market. How do we ensure that the supply is there at the right cost, and just ensuring the quality of that supply? So obviously, as we were liberalising the market, people have to think about not only the market, but the infrastructure that's underpinning the market, how attractive that would be for investors. How do we ensure we can pay for this without actually asking consumers to pick up the entirety of the bill? So looking at that, we need to make sure that the market, as well as the infrastructure supporting that, was attractive to investors.
By the time you got to the late noughties, worries had started to creep in about whether a purely market-based system would attract enough investment in generation to have enough reserves to keep the lights on.
Akshay, Kaul again.
And that was one of the reasons that in 2015, Ofgem referred the energy industry to the Consumers and Markets Authority in a competition investigation to say, is the energy market still working for consumers? Is competition still working for consumers? Obviously, we had all the early gains from innovation and competition coming through, but then after all the changes, after the M&A activity, after all the consolidation, there was a sense that both the generation and retail markets were too concentrated. And when the CMA reported back, they concluded that the generation market was okay. There was no indication that was working to the detriment of consumers, but they definitely pointed out that there was a big detriment in the retail markets, particularly if you had consumers who weren't engaging or weren't very good at switching around between different suppliers. They were being overcharged for their energy. And that's what led ultimately to the introduction of the price cap that we have at the moment.
Exactly what consumers are contracting for is probably important. And I think we need to also continuously refresh how that is coming across and use our consumer insights to get consumer input to understand what it is they're getting and what it is they really need.
Before we carry on with the conversation, let's shed some light on the price cap. The price cap is the maximum price energy suppliers can charge per unit of gas and electricity. Ofgem sets the cap. However, it's not a cap on a consumer's total bill. It still stands. Use more energy, pay more. But it stops companies from overcharging for each unit. So who is it for? Well, the price cap protects 34 million households on basic standard variable tariffs. That's anyone who hasn't actively chosen a specific energy deal. If you've never switched supplier, let a fixed deal expire, or had a supplier go bust, the cap likely protects you. The price cap also prevents the loyalty penalty, meaning suppliers can't offer better deals to consumers who stay with them. The best way to save money is to shop around and find a tariff that suits you and the way you use energy. We are on the brink of a fresh industrial revolution, and it's low carbon. We've reached a pivotal moment where renewable energy has secured its inevitable place at the energy table. The liberalisation of the energy market has invited a multitude of new players, fostering competition and driving down prices for consumers. While the motivation is clear, the urgency is even more pressing. Energy crises may spike and fall, but the climate crisis follows a relentless and unyielding trajectory. This has injected a sense of urgency into the latest energy transition, making it more critical than ever. As we prepare to dedicate much of the rest of our series to the future of energy, let's first delve into the climate context and key numbers that weave into our Insight Energy timeline. This will set the stage for understanding the profound impact and necessity of this transition. With the expert insight of climate scientist Dr Emily Wallace, a fellow in weather and climate extremes at the Met Office and a visiting professor at the University of Strathclyde, we are talking about greenhouse gases here, a product of burning fossil fuels.
0.5 billion years ago, the Earth was created, was born. Since then, the climate has varied an awful lot. So we've been in and out of ice ages over that time. What's happened since the 1800s, so the Industrial Revolution, is that the temperatures have really ramped up rapidly during that period. So to put some numbers around it, if you take the last 2 decades of global average temperatures, which is a really useful measure of this, we're around about 1.1 degree warmer than we were in pre-industrial times. Using a method that looks back a decade and forward a decade, so sort of pinpoints where we are today, we're actually looking around about 1.3 degrees. And as many people know, we actually reached 1.5 degrees last year.
We take a climate average as a stretch of time of 20 years. As we pump more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, so the global temperature continues to rise. 2024 was the hottest year on record globally. Take a look at the hike in global temperature over the past 10 years, and the evidence is clear that the world is warming at a rate of knots. This isn't new information.
It was in the 1950s where we could actually measure those concentrations of greenhouse gases, of carbon dioxide in particular, ramping up, that we were able to show that the burning of fossil fuels was actually materially changing the composition of the atmosphere. Last year, the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere actually increased more than any other year on the record. This year, we're expecting it to be a slightly lower increase, but we're still increasing far faster than is able to limit our global temperatures. We know that around about 2/3 of the emissions annually in our atmosphere are due to the burning of fossil fuels. So it's a really significant amount.
There's a good reason why it's called the climate crisis or climate emergency.
So I described the impact that fossil fuels have had on our global mean temperature. But of course, nobody actually feels the global mean temperature. What we feel is the extremes of the weather that result from that. So yes, looking more locally, our unprecedented heat wave of 2022 has been found to be approximately 10 times more likely because of climate change. The rainfall in the heavy storm season last year is around about 20% more intense because of climate change. And yes, you're right, globally, the heavy rainfall in Bulgaria and Turkey 2023, Greek wildfires 2023, all have a human fingerprint of climate change on them. So we've really got to reduce our emissions to eventually to net zero. So that means reducing the amount we emit and at the same time increasing where we can make negative emissions. This was something we were able to do during the COVID pandemic, where our emissions did reduce because we weren't flying, because of the reduction in the transport and the industry around the world. So it is possible to reduce our emissions.
Decarbonisation is the goal, and so net zero is the target. For the UK, that's to be reached by 2050.
Yeah, so when we're talking about net zero, what we're referring to is our greenhouse gas emissions. So net zero is where our emissions of greenhouse gases have come to a complete halt, or the balance of our emissions and our negative emissions is zero. So that means that what we're emitting is balanced out by what the Earth system is able to suck back out of the atmosphere. At the point where we reach net zero, the concentrations in the atmosphere of greenhouse gases will cease to rise, and in fact they'll start to fall due to absorption into the land and oceans.
There are two mechanisms that climate scientists measure when it comes to carbon dioxide: emissions and concentration.
We're thinking about a bathtub. The emissions is a little bit like the water coming into the bathtub. So we can turn that tap up and down. We can increase or reduce our emissions. The concentrations are more akin to the level in the bathtub. So as we turn the tap up faster and faster, those concentrations are going to be rising. The other nice analogy about a bathtub is it also has a plug hole, and that's equivalent to the negative emissions of the sort of reduction in concentrations that can come from carbon sinks in our oceans and in our forests. So 2024 was an El Nino year, and that means that we've got increased sea surface temperatures in the Pacific. The increased sea surface temperatures in the Pacific really drive up those global average temperatures. It also has a knock-on effect, sadly, on our greenhouse gas concentrations. So ordinarily, the oceans and, in fact, our forests around the world are able to suck in some of our excess CO2 emissions. When the sea surface temperatures are warmer, they can absorb less of that CO2, and so that's why we see such an increase in our concentrations.
While we're striving to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for over 100 years. So it's going to take time to reverse the impacts of climate change.
The rate of increases of emissions has reduced, but emissions are still increasing, and energy makes up around 1/3 of those emissions globally.
And the UK has ambitious plans to go green and reduce our energy emissions by 2030.
There's a few reasons why the energy sector is such a useful one to target for emission reduction. So first of all, being that it's such a large sector. Secondly, it's a gateway to other sectors. So if we can decarbonise our power system, we can then use that power to power transport, building heating, for example. So decarbonising power means that we can decarbonise other sectors. There's also a potential for negative emissions, which we're almost certainly going to need in order to reduce our emissions sufficiently to hit net zero. So, for example, biofuels combined with carbon capture and storage actually mean that we can make negative emissions in total. There's other benefits, health benefits, for example, air pollution, and even ecological benefits from decarbonising our power system. And finally, and this is probably what's driving an awful lot of the changes that we're seeing in the sector, there's actually cost benefits as well. So the cost of the generation technology has come down hugely. If you look at the levelised cost of energy, which is a measure of how expensive the technology is in total, renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil fuels across the board.
The responsibility for hitting this target is with government and industry, but it's also to do with energy usage and the personal choices we make.
I think as consumers, we have become much more environmentally conscious. So the average person understands the benefit of, for example, electric vehicles or being able to reduce their demand. The second-hand market for clothes, for example, has really taken off. And I think that is because people are genuinely concerned and genuinely want to do their bit to reduce our emissions globally.
But the transition to renewables could be a financial one too.
It's estimated that the transition to low carbon energy can be cost positive. So that means that we can be paying less for our power and energy. And in fact, that's borne out in statistics so far. So we're now paying less of a percentage of GDP for our energy than we were in the 2000s. The costs of renewables have come down compared to fossil fuels. So for example, solar is now 56% cheaper than fossil fuels, offshore wind 25% cheaper, and onshore wind 67% cheaper. That's compared to only a decade ago, all of those technologies being more expensive than fossil fuels. The share of renewables is actually now outstripping fossil fuels across Europe, which is great to see.
The UK's journey from energy liberalisation and privatisation to the establishment of a regulatory framework highlights the critical role of markets, industry and policymakers in driving energy transitions. However, the climate crisis demands urgent action. The decarbonisation targets laid out by NESO's Clean Power Plan 2030 underscores the need for accelerated progress. While we've seen how clean energy innovation can scale production and reduce costs, the challenges ahead remain very real. Here are some final thoughts from Mark McAllister, chair of Ofgem, where he summarises the many moving parts.
If you look at the technical challenges, amount of money we need to spend on new networks. So we've got the challenge of the supply chain, of skills, of the transmission operators raising large amounts of money. National Grid recently raised £7 billion on the market, one of the biggest raises ever on the London Stock Exchange. And then we've got the planning challenges. Everybody loves the new system until the pylon is in their parish. So we've got a lot of work to do there. But then there are other things, because so much of this new energy supply will be from renewable resources, which are intermittent, wind and sun. We've got to build a lot of storage into the system, and that's not just batteries. We're looking at long duration storage as well, different forms of storage. I was up at Loch Ness, where there's a proposed project to build a pumped hydro system, which is a system where you pump water up the hill when there's plenty of electricity, plenty of wind, plenty of sun, and then let it come down again and generate its own electricity. The scale of this project was really quite mind-boggling. It was 1.3 gigawatts, which is the scale of one of the reactors at Hinkley Point C, and it could last for 24 hours. So, there's some fantastic technological challenges. But as you look at the different layers of that plan, the one that in many ways is the most challenging is there's 12 gigawatts in there of domestic flex. So that's you and me and the rest of our, the rest of the UK citizens using our energy at different times of the day. And, we're a long way from that at the moment. We're really in the foothills of it. So that, in many ways, that will be, the biggest, I think, technical behavioural challenge. Innovation is essential to the new energy system.
In the next episode, we'll explore the evolution of clean energy, from early innovation to the pivotal moment it surpassed fossil fuel generation, and the potential pathways to achieving the net zero holy grail. My thanks to Dr Emily Wallace and to Mark McAllister, Akshay Kaul and Jenny Boothe from Ofgem for their expert insight on this episode. If you enjoyed it, Share it with someone who also might like it. I'm Claire Nazir. Inside Energy is a Bengo Media production for Ofgem.